Across rivers, parks, and beaches, a chilling pattern unfolds: headless goats, strange rituals, and unanswered questions. Tonight, we unravel the threads of mystery, faith, and folklore to uncover the truth behind these bizarre events. Brace yourself for a journey into the unexplained.
Okay, so get this right. We're going deep on this story, and honestly, it's a little creepy. We're talking like tons of headless goat carcasses just showing up in the weirdest places.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the stranger things we've looked at. It's like all over the country, too. We've got the Chattahoochee River down in Atlanta, Prospect Park up in Brooklyn, even Miami Beach.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
Like way more than just a couple.
That's
so
true.
for this deep dive, we've got a bunch of news reports, and we talked to some experts, even looked into some religious stuff to try and figure out, like, what is going on here?
Yeah, it makes you wonder, why goats, right? I mean, why headless? Somebody out there messing with us.
So let's start with what we know.
Okay, so one of the first things that came up was Santeria. It's an Afro-Caribbean religion.
I've heard of that. It's like they do animal sacrifice as part of their rituals, right?
That's right. They actually blend Yoruba and Christian traditions. It started in Cuba,
Yeah.
back when enslaved Africans brought their beliefs with them.
Wow. So, I mean, could this just be people not understanding what they're seeing? Like maybe they see something and automatically think it's like some crazy ritual?
It's definitely possible. I mean, Santeria is not exactly mainstream, and the idea of animal sacrifice, it can be pretty intense for some people.
Yeah.
Especially those who don't know anything about it. I mean, it's not about being cruel or anything.
So then what's it about? Like, how does it actually work?
Okay, so you've got these orishas, right? They're like deities or spirits. You know, the followers believe in these orishas, and each one has specific offerings.
Yeah.
And the idea is that the offerings strengthen the connection between, whoever's doing the offering and that specific orisha.
So it's like very specific and ritualistic.
Exactly. And animal sacrifice, well, it's just one of the offerings, but they believe it has a lot of power spiritually. It's about giving something that matters to you, to honor, to appease the orishas.
That makes sense, I guess.
Yeah.
But, I mean, still, it's kind of creepy when you think about all those headless goats. And why so public, too?
Yeah, it's not always done the right way, even within Santeria.
What do you mean?
I mean, there are guidelines, ways they're supposed to handle, like disposal and everything. They're supposed to, return the remains to nature. But sometimes maybe they didn't learn the right way or, just don't care. Things happen.
So maybe some of this is Santeria, but not how it's supposed to be done.
Right, and it gets more complicated, too.
How so?
Well, because of the Supreme Court, actually.
Oh, seriously?
Yeah, there was this case, Church of Lukumi Babalu I versus City of Hialeah. Long story short, it made humane animal sacrifice legal, protected by the First Amendment, actually. So, yeah, the whole thing might freak some people out, but it's a protected religious practice now.
Wow. Didn't know that. But what about this Brooklyn thing?
Oh, yeah, the Prospect Park case.
That's the one. Like New York Magazine did this whole investigation, goat heads all over the place. And get this, they found 2 skinned goat heads hanging on a light pole.
Yikes. Definitely not your everyday thing. And it's different from what we know about Santeria. So if not Santeria, then what?
Yeah, what else could it be?
Good question.
So what did the journalists find out?
Well, they talked to everyone, basically. Police, park officials, even the botanicas, the religious supply shops.
Oh, yeah, right.
But nobody really knew anything. It's like they were trying to put together a puzzle with half the pieces missing. And it gets funnier. He actually went to a halal butcher, too, thinking maybe that was the source of the heads. But no luck.
Oh, man. I can only imagine walking into a butcher shop and being like, hey, you got any extra goat heads lying around? But did he ever find anyone who knew anything?
Eventually, he got a lead and talked to this guy, Marcos Quinones, who's an expert in all that occult stuff.
Occult stuff. Sounds spooky. What do you think?
Well, he threw out a few ideas like Santeria, voodoo, even Palomayombe. It's another Afro-Caribbean religion. But even he was like, look, we don't have enough to go on. Stressed how important it is to, keep an open mind.
So even the occult guy wasn't sure. So we've got this religious thing, maybe, but maybe not, and some occult stuff, maybe, and a whole lot of weirdness. Where do we go from here?
Right. It's like a puzzle with half the pieces and none of them fit. And it's about to get even more complicated.
Yeah.
Because this journalist, he finally finds a Santeria priest, Equilud, runs one of those botanicas, and Equilud is like, nope, those hanging heads, not us. He was really sure about it, too.
Whoa, hold on. So if not Santeria, then what? Like, what was his reasoning?
He had a few points. First, he said they were way too disrespectful with the heads. In Santeria, they're big on treating the remains with respect, like carefully.
Right. Yeah.
Second, hanging them on a pole just doesn't fit. They have specific ways to do offerings. This just wasn't it.
So maybe Santeria's off the table for this one. But then what's going on? And what about voodoo? Could that be a connection? Guess we'll have to dive into that in part 2 of this this deep dive. All right, so last time we were talking about all these headless goats, right? Trying to figure out if it was Santeria or something totally different. And we left off with that Santeria priest. He was pretty sure those goat heads in that Brooklyn park, the ones hanging on the light pole. Not Santeria.
Right. It's easy to get caught up in the weirdness of it all,
Wow. But we're trying to look at this whole thing from every angle, not just go for the most shocking thing, right?
For sure. So where do we go from here? If it's not Santeria, then what? Could it be voodoo, like that occult expert was saying?
Well, the journalist did talk to a voodoo priestess, actually, Jamais Bouk Bonmambo Domlage. And she was really interesting. She talked a lot about how people have all these negative stereotypes about voodoo.
Yeah, like the whole voodoo doll thing. Exactly. But she was saying it's not like that at all. It's very celebratory, very community-focused. Their ceremonies are... they have lots of music, dancing, it's about celebrating life.
That's not what I pictured at all, really. I always thought it was kind of dark and mysterious.
Yeah, a lot of people think that. But Jamas was very clear that the hanging goat heads had nothing to do with voodoo.
So I guess we can cross that off the list.
At least for that specific case, yeah.
Right. But we've still got all those other cases, like the Chattahoochee River. That one's like on a whole other level, scale-wise.
Yeah. A lot more goats involved there. And it brings us back to Atlanta, really. And remember how we were talking about maybe some Santeria practitioners, they might not be doing the disposal part right. Well, there's another angle to think about. It comes from Brian Dunning. He wrote that Skeptoid article.
Oh, yeah. He's the one who always tries to find the most logical explanation.
Yeah,
right.
That's him. And so he points out that Atlanta actually has a pretty big Santeria community, lots of practitioners.
Right.
And if you think about it, some Santeria rituals do involve returning the remains to nature, specifically putting them in water.
Yeah, like a river.
Exactly. So, it seems like a pretty likely connection, doesn't it?
It does,
yeah.
Especially with that many goats.
Right. It's like Occam's razor. Simplest explanation is usually the right one. And here, the simplest one is that at least some of those goats were part of Santeria, even if the disposal method was a little off.
Makes sense. But then what about all those news stories blaming drug cartels and black magic and stuff? Those got pretty wild.
Yeah. Dunning actually he talks about those. He says they just don't really hold up if you look at the facts.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. For one thing, this is happening all over, right? It doesn't seem like the work of one group, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And for another thing, drug smugglers sacrificing goats for protection. It doesn't really fit with what we know about Santeria.
So those theories were probably more about getting attention than anything else.
Seems like it. And Dunning, he brings up Dr. Ini Acho Iya again, the one who's talking about how some Santeria practitioners, either they just don't know the right way or they're intentionally doing it wrong, but they give the whole religion a bad name.
So even if some of the Chattahoochee goats were from Santeria, it doesn't mean every Santeria person is dumping stuff in the river.
Yeah.
There's always going to be people who don't get it right or who just use it for their own stuff.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that, you can't judge a whole religion or even a whole cultural practice based on what a few people do.
Right, that's fair. Okay, so it's looking like the Chattahoochee goats, probably Santeria, even if the disposal wasn't ideal. But what about those hanging heads back in Brooklyn? That one still feels like a question mark.
Yeah, that one's definitely an outlier. Even that occult expert, Marcos Quinones, he wasn't sure about that one. He said maybe Santeria, maybe voodoo, maybe Palo Mayombe, but even he was like, we need more information.
So if we're saying it's probably not any of those religions, then what are we left with? Is there any other explanation that makes sense?
Well, remember how the journalist who was investigating the Brooklyn case, how he ended up thinking that a lot of, especially the really out there stuff, it was probably teenagers.
Yeah, the twisted teens. But could teenagers really pull something like that off?
It might sound crazy, but think about it. Teenagers are they're all about pushing boundaries, right? They
Yeah.
want thrills. And sometimes they do things that just don't make sense to adults.
I guess.
And, these days, social media is all about shock value. So if you could pull off something like hanging goat heads in a park, that gets you a lot of attention.
Yeah, it's like a really messed up version of those internet challenge things.
Exactly. And it might seem like a weird explanation, but sometimes the simplest answer is the right one. Sometimes it's not a big conspiracy or a secret cult. It's just some teenagers trying to be edgy.
So we're saying the Chattahoochee goats, probably Santeria, and the Brooklyn thing, probably teenagers.
Based on what we know, yeah, that's the most likely. Of course, we can't be 100% sure about every case, but if you look at the details, get different perspectives, and don't just believe everything you hear, you can usually start to figure things out, even when they're really strange.
Okay, so we've got two main theories then. Santeria for the Chattahoochee goats and teenagers for the Brooklyn stuff. But there are still a lot of questions, like why goats? Why are goats the animal in all of this? What is it about goats?
That is a great question, and it takes us beyond just these specific cases into symbolism, cultural significance. Because goats they have a long history, right? And they can mean really different things depending on the context.
So, like, what kind of symbolism are we talking about here?
Well, in some cultures, they're like symbols of fertility, abundance, life-giving forces, nature, all that. Like, think about the Greek god Pan. He was half goat. He was all about the wild, untamed parts of nature.
Yeah, and there's the whole like stubborn goat thing, right?
Yeah.
Always getting into trouble.
Exactly. And that's another layer of symbolism right there. In some traditions, they're like scapegoats, literally.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they represent something you can sacrifice or blame to make the gods happy or to get rid of sin or bad stuff in general.
Like the scapegoat in the Bible, where they send the goat out into the wilderness to carry away the sin.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
that idea of the scapegoat, it's been around forever, shows up all over the place. So when we see these headless goats, just showing up, it makes you think about what they might represent.
So maybe the people doing this, whether it's Santeria or those teenagers, maybe they're tapping into that deeper meaning, even if they don't realize it.
It's definitely possible. Symbolism can be subconscious. It can affect us without us even knowing. And think about the impact of finding a headless goat. It's shocking. It's mysterious. It taps into some deep-seated stuff.
Yeah, it's kind of creepy, honestly.
Right. So there's definitely a connection there. But even with all this talk about symbolism and culture and all that, I can't help but think about, is it right? Is it okay to use animals like this?
Yeah, that's a good point. We talked about that a little before, but it's something we should definitely talk about more. I mean, we talk about why people do this, but should they?
Right. And it's a tough question. People have really strong feelings about it. Some people say any animal sacrifice is wrong no matter what. Others say it's part of their religion and it should be protected.
Yeah, we want to be respectful of different religions and cultures, but we also have to think about how we're treating animals.
It's a balance, and it's not an easy one. It's a really complicated ethical question, and maybe the best way to deal with it is to talk about it openly, listen to each other.
So for anyone listening, we want to know what you think. What are your thoughts on all this? Where do you draw the line? These aren't easy questions, but they're important ones to think about.
Because in the end, it's about understanding how we relate to animals and to each other.
Well said. And on that note, I think we're gonna wrap up this deep dive. We hope you found it interesting. We certainly did. And until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep an open mind. All right, so we've talked a lot about these headless goats, right? We've looked at Santeria, we've talked about teenagers, and we've even debunked some of the weirder stuff out there. But I gotta say, there's one question I keep coming back to.
What's that?
Why goats? Like, out of all the animals, why goats? What is it about goats that makes them, the stars of this whole weird show?
It's a good question, and it's one that takes us beyond just these specific cases, We have to think about symbolism, what things mean in different cultures. Because goats, they have a really long history with humans, and they've meant different things to different people at different times.
Okay, so what kind of symbolism are we talking about here? Like, what do goats represent?
Well, for some cultures, goats are all about fertility, abundance, life. you know? Nature. They're
Yeah.
connected to those ideas. Like, the Greek god Pan.
Yeah, vaguely.
Well, he was half goat, right. And he was all about nature, the wild parts of it, the untamed parts.
Right, right. And there's also that whole thing about goats being like stubborn, headstrong,
Yeah,
always getting into trouble.
exactly. And that actually connects to another layer of symbolism too, because in some traditions, they're like scapegoats, literally.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they symbolize something that you can sacrifice or blame to like appease the gods or to cleanse a community, get rid of bad stuff, sin, you know.
So like the scapegoat in the Bible,
Uh,
where they send a goat off into the wilderness to carry away everyone's sins.
exactly. And that idea, the scapegoat idea, it's been around for a long time. It shows up all over the place. So when we see all these headless goats showing up in random places, it's hard not to think about that, you know, what they might symbolize.
So maybe the people doing this, whether it's Santeria or teenagers, maybe
Yeah.
they're connecting to that symbolism without even realizing it.
Maybe. I mean, symbolism can work that way, right? It can be subconscious,
Yeah.
affect you without you even knowing it's happening. And think about how it feels to find a headless goat. It's shocking, mysterious. It kind of gets under your skin, connects to some deep stuff, you know?
Yeah, it's kind of disturbing, honestly.
Right. So there's definitely something there. But even with all this talk about symbolism and culture and everything, I keep thinking, is it right? Is it okay to use animals like this for any reason?
That's a really good point. We touched on it before, but it's a conversation worth having. Like, we've been talking about why people might be doing this, but should they be doing this?
It's a tough question, and it's one that people have really strong feelings about. Some people say any kind of animal sacrifice is wrong, period. Others say it's part of their religion and it should be protected. It's their right.
It's a tough one. We want to be respectful of different beliefs, different cultures, but we also have to think about the animals.
Exactly. It's all about balance. And it's not an easy balance to find. It's a complicated ethical question. And maybe the best way to deal with these kinds of questions is to just talk about them openly and honestly, hear each other out.
So, to everyone listening out there, we want to hear from you. What do you think? Where do you draw the line between respecting people's beliefs and protecting animals? These are tough questions, but they're
Right.
important. We want you to think about them. Really think about them.
Because it's all about understanding in the end. Understanding how we relate to animals and how we relate to each other.
Well said. And on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive. We hope you found it interesting. We know we did. And until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep an open mind.